Analog horror has definitely been on the decline for a while now. Not necessarily in quality, but definitely in popularity. And a big reason for this is how oversaturated the genre has become recently. So when a new series comes along that does something in quite a different way from the other series, it will get the attention of the wider analog horror community. And one of the most recent of these series is The Painter. The Painter is an analog horror series made by UrbanSPOOK, which details the crimes of a deranged serial killer who paints his victims. The series has been praised by many people as a fresh take on analog horror as a whole. However, is much of this praise really justified? This is what this video is about. Without further ado, let's begin. Let's start off with a brief synopsis of the events. UrbanSPOOK's The Painter is a series of reports on a deranged serial killer, well, actually two deranged serial killers, who would make these stylized and disturbing paintings of their victims. Along the way, the police are slowly getting more and more clues as to who these people could be. The story is yet to conclude at the time of recording this video. Now that the synopsis is out of the way, we can finally start with the actual review. Let's start with the positives first. By far, the best part of this series for me is definitely the artwork. UrbanSPOOK is a genuinely talented artist, and it shows in the art that it is shown within the series. It really gives this vibe that the artwork came from a surreal nightmare. It's really good. Another thing that I really like about this series is how relatively grounded the series is when compared to other analog horror series. Many of the events in the earlier episodes are scarier because they could plausibly happen to anyone. The series itself isn't real, but what it does deal with is a very real thing. Because unlike aliens or demons, serial killers actually do exist. Well, we're not entirely too sure about aliens, but that's besides the point. And the thought that you could be living next to one and could even be a target without you knowing it is a terrifying thing to think about. The overall atmosphere of the series, especially the ambience music in the background, does a really good job at putting you in an uneasy mood. And the presentation really improves as the series goes on. As an example for how much the presentation has improved, there is actually a 911 call in the latest episode at the time of recording.
What's your emergency? Okay, now, what's the address?
They killed my husband.
Oh, okay, the police are on their way. What's your name?
Isabel Jackson.
Okay, Isabel, do you have anything to defend yourself with?
Oh my God, they're gonna get it. Please help me.
That is haunting to listen to. Overall, The Painter does a really good job in terms of the artwork, the presentation, and the atmosphere that it offers, on top of the fact that many of the early episodes feel very grounded in reality. Sure, it's clearly nothing fancy, but does it really need to be? Not every analog horror series needs to have absolutely stellar editing, live action moments, and other shit like that. Sometimes simplicity does the job fine. Unfortunately, this is where my praise of the series ends. UrbanSPOOK's The Painter relies heavily on shock content to scare the audience. Now, there's nothing wrong with including shock content in horror. As a matter of fact, I actually encourage it. But shock content is a bit like salt. A little bit of salt is fine, but too much will ruin the dish. If you use too much shock content, it stops being scary and starts being boring and kind of a slog to go through. Also, since I am pretty sure that I have a mostly young audience, I am going to give a content warning for the next part. If you're in any way a very sensitive person, I suggest you skip forward or click off the video. The Painter seems to be trying to escalate the shocking content in order to make the viewer more scared. Oh, you were shocked by a guy having his face cut off and his wrist slit? How about multiple people having their face cut off? This isn't even the most egregious example of this escalation. In Pigs, the 6th episode of the series, a woman is discovered to have died from internal bleeding. A dead horse next to her was fed sildenafil, which is Viagra, and her portrait was entitled Breeding Mount May, the implication being that she was fucked to death by a literal horse. In the next episode, a pregnant woman is discovered to have her unborn child ripped out of her womb and forced down the throat of her husband, who who died from choking on it. While this is most likely meant to leave the viewer more horrified, in my experience it left the opposite effect. There's this thing that was originally applied to things like video games or card games called power creep. Basically, newer and more powerful stuff is constantly added to like a game or a series that slowly makes the old stuff obsolete. And while this is intended to make its media more exciting, it actually has the opposite effect, where instead the viewer is left bored because they've already seen the song and dance before. This kind of exists in Urban Spooks the Painter, but instead of power creep, it's brutality creep, where the continuous creeping of the brutality, instead of making the viewer go, oh my god, that's horrible, it makes them go, oh, that's brutal. Anyways, because shock content without actual substance is boring. And by far the worst example of the shock value happens in the third episode. To provide context, in the first video of the series, we see a portrait entitled Fuck Toy Corey, with no victim that this could apply to. In the third episode, when we finally learn about the victim, we learn that he's 11. Now, I'm gonna make it clear right now that there's nothing wrong with adding child rape into your story as long as you handle it with respect and intelligence. But I don't think that child rape in this story was handled with the level of respect that the topic deserves. Instead of just being for shock value to make us recoil in horror, this was shock value without substance. It kind of reminds me of some creepypastas that would add rape to a story for the sheer purpose of shocking us. Not only is it not scary and boring, it's also borderline disrespectful. In conclusion, Urban Spooks the Painter does many things right, especially its atmosphere and artwork, but it is crippled by its over-reliance on shock value, which is boring at best and offensive at worst. With these flaws in the story, the series is overrated in many aspects. Now, you may be asking me, but Taiga, if the series is so overrated, why do so many people like the series? Well, simply put, I think the reason why many people like it is that it just stands out. Had The Painter come out in 2012, it would have been regarded as generic and overly edgy, with the popularity of edgy and cliched creepypastas that used the same shock value techniques as The Painter, that dominated internet horror at the time. However, luckily for The Painter, it came out in 2022, where extremely safe FNAF-style horror is king amongst internet horror, where creators try to replicate the success of series like the Mandela Catalog and the Walton Files, oversaturate the genre with a deluge of horror, where the scariest aspect is simply how far faces can be stretched with Photoshop. In this context, what would have been a generic and overly edgy series becomes unique and transgressive and a breath of fresh air for disillusioned analog horror fans. In this sense, The Painter's best asset isn't the art or the vibes, but its timing of release. I was originally going to end the video here, but I have one more thing to touch up upon. Urban Spook deserves to be criticized for a lot of things, including his nonchalant use of sensitive topics in his series purely for shock value, and selling the paintings depicting these things on the internet for cash money. However, despite this, if you go onto circles where people are criticizing Urban Spook, you will often find people accusing him of being the worst fucking things possible, like being a closeted pedophile or a possible rapist. Here's a little thing I have to say about people who are making these accusations. You don't know this guy. The only reason you know him is because he created a series that, while true, was distasteful and didn't handle sensitive subject matters properly, does not deserve some of you labeling him as a pedophile or a possible rapist or killer or something. You do not know this guy. You're making baseless accusations accusing him of being some of the worst human beings possible, simply because you did not like his series. What the fuck? Anyways, thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do not harass any of the people featured in this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye.